As a Linux or Mac user, it is really easy to mock Windows. It is so easy to mock Windows, and Windows honestly gives us a million reasons to make fun of it on an almost daily basis. When we woke up this morning, the whole world was blue screen of deathing thanks to a update to CrowdStrike that took down darn near every modern Windows computer on the planet, it seemed like. We saw airports and kiosks and personal computers and whole companies just blue screened into oblivion. It was fantastic. It was laughable. We wanted to make fun of it. As Linux and Mac users, we wanted to use that moment to gloat over how much better our systems are than this stupid rickety Windows. There's just a little bit of a problem with that. We, on the Linux and Mac side, have some absolutely horrific examples of very similar things happening. Simple updates that completely destroy systems on our side as well. I wanted to walk you through a little bit of this. And yes, I agree. It is fun to make fun of blue screens of death. I celebrated Blue Screen of Death Day over at the Lunduke Journal the moment I woke up. As soon as I saw this news, I started collecting pictures of everybody posting their blue screens of death created by CrowdStrike on all manner of different systems all over the world. And you know what? It was pretty doggone funny. It still amuses me. And the statements that are coming out from CrowdStrike, the apologies, sort of, that are coming out from CrowdStrike, they are laughable and funny. This was obviously a very simple blunder, and somebody's going to be in a lot of trouble for it. But I've also seen a huge amount of people, including incredibly smart people that I have a deep amount of respect for, coming out and using this as an opportunity to talk about how much better Linux, Mac, and open source and free software are, because you are not as likely to experience these sorts of issues. I want to read this tweet here from Eric Raymond. And if you don't know who Eric Raymond is, he is an absolute legend. He wrote The Cathedral and the Bazaar, one of the seminal works of open source. He was involved in the open sourcing of Netscape Navigator. He's maintained a huge number of critically important and as well as just sometimes fun open source pieces of software over the years. He's in general someone who's very worth listening to when it comes to open source ideas. And so I'm going to read what he wrote here. The folly of closed source strikes again. Every computer running CrowdStrike Falcon crashed a few hours ago and is stuck in a boot loop that requires manual intervention by an expert to fix. This is a significant percentage of all the Windows machines in the world. Huge swaths of infrastructure are down at airlines, hospitals, police stations, portions of the power grid, and that's only the beginning. I contrast this with the way a huge compromise of open source infrastructure was headed off earlier this year when the XZ Trojan was discovered. Because all that code was open sourced and could be audited, somebody caught it in time, before it could escape onto the net and do real damage. And all I can do is shake my head wearily and wonder, are you people just plain stupid? And I and others have been trying to warn everyone for decades about the fragility of closed source software and the proprietary distribution chain. Secrecy proliferates places for bugs to lurk. It's a good sentence. As our civilization depends more and more dependent on software to keep the wheels turning, the risk and deadliness of that secrecy is only rising. Take this day as a warning, because the next disaster of this kind will only be worse and could cost millions of lives. Get the hell out of closed source now, not just operating systems like Windows, but applications too. The civilization you save could be your own. All right, now I wanted to address a little bit of that because I agree with some of it and profoundly disagree with others. For a little bit of background, the XZ bug that was talked about in here, not really even a bug, the XZ vulnerability. That was found somewhat by accident, so to speak. One individual developer at Microsoft noticed a fraction of a second delay in one of his operations that he was regularly running, which caused him to investigate, and the availability of the source code in XZ allowed him to find that vulnerability, to find that exploit that had been maliciously and intentionally placed in the code. That subverted and fixed what could have been a potentially massive data breach worldwide. So what Eric Raymond says here is absolutely true in that case. And there are many cases where having many eyes on the code results in some pretty significant benefits in terms of security. In fact, Eric follows this up because a lot of people were giving him pushback, as he put it, and so he responded with some additional quotes here. Well, I'm going to read this to you now. And then I'm going to point out to you some of the examples where having the source code didn't help at all and were in fact a spectacular failure. Eric said, quote, "I'm getting some pushback against my previous post that I just read to you from people who think we should be blaming automated update push systems for today's massive outage, not closed source. This is a narrow, insufficiently holistic view of how the difference between closed and open source ecosystems cash out. To see this, start by asking one simple question. How did this patch escape getting enough auditing to catch the bug before it went net wide? If you guessed not enough eyeballs on the source, you win, because that's pretty much always the reason. Closed source definitionally strangles such auditing. Quote, but it could happen in open source too, end quote. Of course it could, because open source is not a magic bullet against software complexity, because nothing is that magic bullet. But it hasn't. One reason it hasn't is that in open source land, updates are generally pull rather than push. They happen on the user's timing, not the vendor's, so they don't happen all at once, and risk-tolerant early adopters can raise the alarm before a bug or crack can wreak real havoc. Power is in the hands of the users, where it belongs. This isn't just something to sing kumbaya about, it is a risk mitigation. How much of one? Well, reality just punched us in the face with evidence of how much open source makes your odds better. The XZ hack in February could have caused the worst worldwide outage in history, but didn't because it was caught in time. This one wasn't and did. So he's right on some of those things. One of the things that he's not 100% correct about, though, is the fact that we're not seeing those sorts of problems on the open source side of things. In fact, we are, and we have historically seen some pretty spectacular examples of open source software, popular open source software with lots of eyes on it, shipping tremendously destructive or tremendously embarrassing bugs. One of my favorite examples is one from a few years back. One of the early days of Ubuntu, back in, what year was this? 2006? Back in 2006. I know, we're going a ways back here. We'll go to some more recent stuff in a second. But this 2006 bug in a version of Ubuntu made it so that when a system got updated to the latest version of Ubuntu, XOrg broke. Now, what does that mean? It means your whole display server broke. It means you no longer have the ability to boot into a graphical desktop on any of your systems. This particular bug says, and I always found this rather funny because I remember covering this at the time. Included a fix, this is the bug patch name, included a fix for a PCI support bug, which inadvertently caused the X server to fail to start for some users. Okay, now by some users, they mean almost every user. As in, like, if you installed this update to Ubuntu on 20 systems, 19 of them would not no longer be able to boot into a graphical desktop. It was massive. I also love the statement, this was a bug which inadvertently caused every Ubuntu system out there to not be able to boot into a graphical desktop. What bug that does that would be intentional? It's an inadvertent one. Oh, well, that changes things. Oh, of course it was an inadvertent one. They didn't put it in there on purpose. But this isn't a solo example. And to give you another example of one that should have been caught and did not cause any data destruction or loss, but was so extremely obvious that it should have been caught. Look at the release of Ubuntu 23.10. And the reason we're talking about Ubuntu is because it's the most popular, or at least was the most popular, or sometimes the most popular. It is a very popular Linux distribution. So we're going to look at that because it has so many eyes on it. When 23.10 was released in 2023, just this last year, it was rather fascinating in that the text for the installer contained a huge amount of anti-Semitic and pornographic statements. Like, it was off the charts. It was vulgar. It was obscene. There was stuff about how evil Jews are, stuff about all sorts of things. It was really, really gross. And it was impossible to install this version of Ubuntu without seeing that text. It was only available in certain languages, but what that means is that nobody from Ubuntu or the parent company Canonical, not one human being, installed the operating system they were shipping prior to shipping it. Because if they had, they would have seen, because it was right in your face. It was like blasted in your face. I remember covering this last year when this happened, and it was like, holy heavens. Even when I was covering it, I had to censor it dramatically. It was off the charts. There was no possible way to even have installed the operating system without having gone, oh my heavens. And yet it shipped. And it wasn't until it shipped and end users started installing this system that everyone was like, what did you just send me? What installation image did you just give me, Ubuntu? Because it is filled with pornographic statements, vulgar statements, attacks on Jews. It was crazy. Now, that wasn't a data loss issue. This didn't cause the system to not boot, but it was something that no piece of software would ship with if you would have even looked at it. Open source, free software, hundreds, if not thousands of contributors were looking at those check-ins that had that code added in, that were looking at those individual build images, that were playing around with the installers, hundreds and thousands of people looking at the source code constantly. Of them, and it was the most obvious first thing you see when you boot the system, the thumb drive or the CD image when you go to install that system, and they missed that. How is that possible? Well, it means no one even tried. What that means is, in the open source world, yes, having access to the source code does, in fact, if the code is being looked at, allow us to sometimes mitigate those sorts of issues. And this is clearly seen in the example of the XZ vulnerability, that particular intentional malicious vulnerability. But the fact that we caught that one was almost a fluke. No one was doing an active audit of XZ at the time. The XZ maintainers and developers were either in on it or not paying attention to it. And yet here we are. We managed to fix that one, but all these other ones, they made it out into the wild without nary a test being run. And this is on not just some hobbyist system, but the biggest, most publicly talked about Linux distribution in all the land. This caused me to think a little bit. I wrote an article many years back, 5 years ago, for Linux Journal magazine. May she rest in peace. I used to be the deputy editor over there. Those were fun days. In Linux Journal magazine, I wrote an article called "Some Linux Bugs Have All the Fun." And I wanted to read a couple of snippets here because when we go through I go through several bugs that are just hilarious in their ridiculousness. And there are so many. I want to point this out. At the end of November of 2017, a bug occurred in macOS X that allowed anyone to gain root access to any Macintosh running the latest version of the OS by following these steps. Turn on the Macintosh, type root as your username, don't enter a password, and hit enter. Boom, you're root. That is actually a real thing that happened. Now, does that make every Macintosh immediately stop running? No, but it means that every Macintosh, for at least a certain period of time, until they fixed it, was vulnerable to the simplest possible complete system ownage, right? They were completely vulnerable. And it was a ridiculous fluke. But here's the crazy thing. I'm gonna go ahead and where is this here? Oh, there's Shell Shock. Do you guys remember Shell Shock from 2014? Massive issue. Massive amounts of compromised systems around the world. It was huge. It was a huge issue, and it was mitigated rather quickly. Many distributions and whatnot had patches in place to fix the Shell Shock bug, which allowed a lot of people to gain privileged execution rights on systems, on Linux systems and Mac systems very quickly. But it was a massive deal. Was that open source? Yes. Was the code available for thousands of people to look at? Yes. Did it cause us to be able to fix it before it became a problem? No, it did not. These sorts of issues happen. Now here's a really fun one. Go back to 2015, okay? Go back to 2015 and imagine that you're running a Linux distribution, right? Your laptop or your desktop is running a Linux distribution. It's the year 2015. Well, you turn on that machine, and once you're at the GRUB loader, GRUB is your bootloader, right? Every Linux distribution, by and large, runs a GRUB. So you may not even know what GRUB is, but it boots up and allow you to say, yes, I want to boot my Linux machine, and you hit enter, and that's GRUB. Well, if you're at that GRUB menu, that little GRUB 2 boot menu, and you hit backspace 28 times, this is not a joke, kaboom, you're entered into a rescue shell. And from that rescue shell, you can do pretty much anything you want to your system, including loading custom versions of the kernel, deleting files all over the place, even just completely trashing the system. Literally, you can, from any of those machines with the vulnerable versions of GRUB, just simply sit there and go, backspace, do that 28 times, and boom, you're in with full access to the system. Now, all of that is open source. Ask yourself, how long do you think that vulnerability was out there in the wild before it was caught and fixed? Well, that vulnerability was out there for 6 years. So any version of that GRUB bootloader from 2009 to 2015, yeah, you could just sit down and go backspace, 28 times, and boom, you're in. 6 years. Did having more eyes on the code help us mitigate that issue? How many times was that exploited over the course of 6 years before it got patched? All open source. All absolutely off the charts level of ridiculous. I mean, absolutely insanely ridiculous. And yet, there it is. This wasn't closed source systems. This wasn't Windows. This was Linux. And 100% open source and free software across the board. My point here is that while it is easy to make fun of Windows for many reasons, and yes, absolutely, Eric Raymond makes a very valid and compelling argument that you are going to find more issues and resolve them quicker with open source software than with closed source. I would posit that the difference is minuscule. Is small, because we have so many examples of absolutely hilarious, ridiculous, super easy to find bugs across some of the most popular and actively used Linux software on planet Earth that are open source, but we don't find the issues. For years in some cases. Holy heavens. And yes, in many cases, those have come back to bite us on the keister rather hard. And I want to follow up with just one little tiny thing. I want to read to you a comment that was posted over onto Hacker News. And this was a comment from one individual, but multiple people have been posting similar tidbits about this. And so I want to read this to you now. Quote, CrowdStrike did this to our production Linux fleet back in April 19th, and I've been dying to rant about it. The short version was, we're a civic tech lab, so we have a bunch of different production websites made at different times on different infrastructure. We run CrowdStrike provided by our enterprise. CrowdStrike pushed an update on a Friday evening that was incompatible with up-to-date Debian stable. So we patched Debian as usual, everything was fine for a week, and then all of our servers across multiple websites and cloud hosts simultaneously hard crashed and refused to boot. When we connected one of the disks to a new machine and checked the logs, CrowdStrike looked like a culprit. So we manually deleted it, the machine booted, tried reinstalling it, and the machine immediately crashes again. Okay, let's file a support ticket and get an engineer on the line. CrowdStrike took a day to respond and then asked for a bunch more proof beyond the above that it was their fault. They acknowledged the bug a day later and weeks later had a root cause analysis that they didn't cover our scenario, Debian stable, running version N-1, I think, which is a supported configuration, in their test matrix. In our own post-mortem, there was no real ability to prevent the same thing from happening again. We push software to our machines anytime we want, whether or not it's urgent, without testing it, seems to be the core model, particularly if you're a small IT part of a large enterprise. What they're selling to the enterprise is exactly that they'll do that. So this is I want to caution everybody, because yes, this is a great opportunity to make fun of Microsoft. Please do that. Any opportunity to make fun of Microsoft is very much warranted. It is a very reasonable opportunity to laugh about blue screens of death, because they are common and they are laughable and joke-worthy, and please do that as well. Heaven knows I certainly have. Sorry. The blue screens of death pictures, they make me happy. And it is also a good opportunity to talk about how valuable open source software is in mitigating some of these potential risks. However, don't get cocky. Because realistically, if we want to sit down and compare all of the potential and actually in the wild shipping problems that have happened on Linux and Mac and Windows and all these other systems, we're going to be here for a long time, and absolutely every major OS is going to have a tremendous amount of egg on their face. Not least of which is all of the Linux systems, especially Ubuntu, who has shipped with some absolutely bonkers bugs over the years. It's a lot. And the bugs that they've shipped with, like last year's crazy shipping of weird, vulgar, anti-Jewish pornographic statements in the installer screen, it doesn't exactly give a lot of confidence in the model of, oh, it's open source, so lots of eyes are on it, therefore these sorts of problems won't occur. It still requires manual testing. And yes, some of the people out there who are saying one of the core problems here is the fact that updates are pushed out. They're exactly right. And those things are happening on Windows, on Mac, and on Linux systems alike. And with that, by the way, if you aren't subscribing to the Lunduke Journal, head on over to lunduke.com or lunduke.locals.com, click on a whole bunch of links and subscribe over there. It's fantastic. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, it's a good sales pitch, right? Boys and girls, nerds and nerdettes across the inner tubes, I do declare, end broadcast.